So we will start with the webinar. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to the last webinar on grassland restoration organized by the EXPBIO-Project. I'm Katrien van den Bussel from the Vlaamse Landmaatschappij, the Flemish Land Agency, where I work in the Department of Agro-Environmental Schemes. The EXPBIO-Project is funded by the EU Interreg North Sea Programme and is a collaboration of 8 partners across Sweden, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium. We are municipalities, universities, botanical gardens, public research institutes and governmental agencies. The EXPBIO-Project is focusing on restoration of grassland biodiversity and bringing back natural flower-rich habitats in the North Sea region. By combining expertise from different countries, we are exploring practical management practices and creating tools to boost the local plant communities. This spring, we kicked off a series of webinars on seed mixtures and seed cultivation. Those recordings are still available at the EXPBIO Interreg website. This fall, we continue this journey with 6 inspiring speakers sharing new insights and proven strategies for the restoration and rediversification of grasslands across Northwest Europe. In the previous 5 webinars, we already saw a whole range of management practices for obtaining species-rich grassland. And today, we continue with the lecture of Professor Johannes Kollmann, who is here today to present his research on the establishment and effects of flower strips in arable landscapes. He will tell us about the diversity and interaction of plants and insects in contrasting types of flowering strips. The research of Professor Kollmann focuses on the restoration of ecosystems destroyed by human activities. In particular, he investigates semi-natural reference systems, criteria for selecting plants for restoration purposes, plant-animal interaction, invasive alien species, and long-term monitoring of restored systems. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour, with 30 to 40 minutes for the presentation, and afterwards we will have time for discussing. Just some technical matters. I would like to introduce you Gunilla Hell-Bellman, who is responsible for the technical aspects you see here on the screen. She will ensure that everything runs smoothly. We also kindly ask you to mute your microphone and use the chat function for communication and questions. With that, I give the floor to you, Professor Kollmann.
Thank you. Thank you, Katharina and Gunilla, for inviting me. Thank you to the audience for coming, spending your precious hours just before Christmas with me and this topic here. So the previous ones by Hans de Kroon and others, Sandrine, focused mostly on grasslands, on dikes and other sites. So my job is slightly different today. So we go into arable landscapes and look not so much on grasslands. Actually, grasses are not our big friends. As you can see here on the left side, we have maize, corn, which is quite dominating.
We can't see your picture. We can't see your pictures.
You can't see my picture. I'm sorry. Then I have to open that again. That's not my intention. All other things were correct. No, this is not the one. Sorry. Give me a second. Stop, and then we share again. This one. Does it work now?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Good, but I won't start again. So that's the picture where I started telling you about grasses that can be very dominant, and we are not talking about grasslands. We're not so much talking about cornfields. We talk about these flowering strips, and I will take 30 minutes of your precious time. So the first question is, of course, why flower strips in agricultural landscapes? Flower strips have been around for a while. I guess this started in Switzerland in the 90s when I back was at ETH. We did some work on flower strips, and then in the past 30 years, they have become quite popular. So many studies are there, and I won't show you an overview of all studies. I just show you my personal perspective, and that includes some reviewing work. So the arguments why doing that, is, of course, first that agriculture is in a crisis. Even farmers would agree it's like this. And also our students, Teresa Eisenrieder, one of our first semester students here at the Technical University, she states, I find it simply sad that society as a whole looks down on agriculture. Yeah, that's also my opinion. Then, of course, there's time now for better news. So I guess we would agree on this. And better news is also needed for policy, agricultural policy, and agriculture is tightly linked in Belgium or in Denmark or in Netherlands or Sweden. It's all the same. So we have politicians that are quite close to farmers' unions in this case. And this is our Bavarian Minister of Agriculture, Michaela Kaniber. She's doing a very good job. And so is Walter Heidel. And they meet in the field. And as the local newspaper tells, they are on a flirtous course. So, and the things they do, they have a wildflower in between them. So this is, of course, the cornflower. And they stand in a flower strip and not in the adjacent sugar beet plantation. So that I find interesting. So apparently biodiversity is good news also for these people, and that's very welcome. If we then look at biodiversity in arable landscapes, you can do this in the Netherlands or in whatever, or in Bavaria. We had a large project. We looked at different levels at agriculture. So first we had landscapes types all over Bavaria that were dominated by agriculture or by forestry or by urban areas. And then inside these areas, we had always arable fields or grasslands, forests, settlements as habitats. And then we compared the biodiversity and lots of other things there and found out, not a big surprise, that agriculture has the lowest number of species. So it looks often like in the background, and species like Ligusia, Speculum veneris, a rare one, is not seen so often. So we are in a situation where the farmers, they complain about the prices of their crops and so on, and nature conservation people also complain. So it's a kind of competition, as it's said here by Peter Strohschneider. He was a guy trying to mitigate the conflicts between agriculture and conservation in Germany. So he stated both the agricultural and environmental sectors find themselves in a kind of losing race. Who is worse off? Continuing, then we could look at insects. That's just going up the food chain, and we did also in that project lots of traps. The project was called Landcliffe, has produced numerous publications. Among them, looking at Osmia bicornis, this fantastic wild bee, and it turns out that again, arable land is not so good for biodiversity. So that continues then. This is not our work on birds. So if we compare insectivorous species like the windchat or seed eaters, granivorous species like the common linnet, you see this is a big difference. The omnivores, they do fairly well, like blackcap, while the insectivores, they are declining, and the seed-eaters have a very bad time. So the authors of that study said our findings suggest that the decline of insectivores is primarily associated with agricultural intensification and loss of grassland habitat. Yeah, so what to do? That's one of the most famous graphs most of you have seen before, I guess. I like it very much, although the story is sad, but it's well done because we have not a single course for this thing. It's also not an individual or single farmer to be blamed. So there's many courses having significant effects, but we must admit that intensive agriculture and insecticides and deforestation and so on have a big share. So that's here shown for insect decline, but it's true for many other groups. And we could do better. So one of the lifelines or life belts, I would say, to solve the problem is agri-environmental schemes, for example, flower strips or flower fields. Here I only use the term flower strip, but sometimes it's a field. So that's the life belt we want to focus at today. So the first question is, of course, what is known? A lot is known from all European countries, also from abroad. Simon Dietzel, one of my former PhD students, did a survey, rather simple. You will see more complicated at the end of the presentation. So he looked at the literature of arthropods and found out, reviewing the literature for about 7 years, that there's positive effects of the wildflower flower strips on all disorders from the Coleoptera to the Orthoptera. There's some variation, but generally it's a positive signal, especially for the Coleoptera and the Hymenoptera, so the species that are most dear to most people. It also is seen then for their functional groups, so predators linked to the carabidites and also pollinators, wild bees are supported. Others or pests are not supported, but I think that is a rather positive signal. Yeah. So what I will show you today in these few minutes I have are 3 research cases from my group. So the first one is not wildflower strips, but it shows you a bit the history of my group. So some years ago, we started working on the question, can we reintroduce arable plants into crop fields? How to do is also a lot to be known and a lot to be learned for wildflower strips. So therefore I start there. Then we will look at the flower strips, which seed mixtures to be used is the question here. And you will also have a background of some ecological theory there. And finally, we will look at a recent review that Simon did, and that is not submitted, but will be submitted next week. And that's about flower strips, landscapes, and climate change, and how the interactions are there. So you will learn more about that. Okay, the first one is work done by these PhD students, Julia and Marian. It's a long project, several fundings involved. I only show 2 here. And the question was, how can we introduce arable weeds? We call them arable plants because we have this impression that most of our arable weeds are so clean due to many decades of herbicides that we can dare reintroducing rare species, of course, only in organic farming. But here we go. First question was how dense should the crop be? And we had a factorial large experiment in one of our experimental farms where we tested different crop types and different densities. And here you see for 3 of these beauties how it developed first, second, third year, and then crop density standard, and then no crop density, 0, then 25%, and then 100%. And the full density is not advantageous for the species, but still this threshold line I have shown here is somehow what we would have expected. So we somehow do better in these species in Ligusia, but we do slightly worse than what we expect from seeding. And the reduced density of the crop would, of course, be favorable. Question is then how much should we sow? So that was basically unknown before we started. Would a few seeds be sufficient, or do we need a lot of seeds? So this is shown here from 0 to 6,000 seeds per square meter in case of this Ligusia, and for the large seeded ones, the other ones, it's slightly less. And there's this classical saturation curve. The more you seed, the more plants you get in the arable plot, but that's not a fully linear relationship. And if we then look how many seeds are produced then in the following year, then the saturation curve is very clear. We have had plots, pure sowing, mixed sowing of these 3 species, and then including weeds, common weeds, or weeding these other weeds. And basically, it's all the same story. We have a saturation curve. And if we then plot the so-called lambda, so how many seeds are produced per seed sown, and you see there is a quadratic relationship. So we have at about 150 to 100 to 150 seeds sown, we have the highest production of seeds. If you sow more, then of course you get more plants, but these plants have fewer flowers and fewer seeds. Therefore, this is this optimum, this quadratic curve. It's basically the same wisdom a farmer would have. He would not sow barley or whatever in a too dense way. Then finally, of course, the question was, do these species then last in the system? And for that, they need to have a seed bank. So we followed up in various fields. So these are farms. I only show 1 farm, but we had 7 farms. We had order of crop types, starting with spelt and then rye and then wheat. And then after the third year, we investigated the seed bank. There's this colorful background. And the expectation would have been that the things we have sown somehow materialize. And you see that in Ligusia, there's actually a seed bank built up. Consolida is slightly declining. Lithospermum is more or less stable. So we conclude that our measures have a long-term impact because the seeds stay in the seed bank. So finally, the farmers then, of course, ask, is that costly? Do we get less yield? And we did then various experiments. I just the one on winter rye here, where you see the increasing against density of these mixed target species from 1 seed sown until up to 10,000 seeds sown per square meter. You see that up to 150 or 200 or 800, there is no effect. Then maybe even a beneficial effect, but then there is a decline. So we have about 10% loss in rye at about 800 seeds per square meter, but that's almost unrealistic because we recommend sowing 50 to 100 to 200, 150 seeds. And on the right side, you see the difference between doing weeding of the spontaneous plants or doing not, and there's no effect. Okay, that was the first story, and I conclude that with some slightly general stories. So we have an arable field like this one here, and please, please, please don't focus only on these lovely plants and butterflies, but be aware that's a complicated system. We have the restoration ecology, that's my profession, looking at vegetation resilience. We have the agricultural science, the farmers, they are mostly keen on productivity. And then we have the landscape planning in establishing environmental schemes often calls for landscape planning. So they ask for multifunctionality. And if we do it right, and all these 3 groups are involved, then we have ecological filter effects, green infrastructure, and restoration success. And then the thing could eventually work. But I tell you that farmers are not too keen on seeding weeds in their fields. And even some of the organic farmers were not so happy. And therefore we said, well, then we have to do a separation and have to do restoration outside the arable field. And that basically leads us to the flower strips, the topic of today's presentation. And here we have Francie Möck, one of my current PhD students. And we did a large-scale experiment on one of our experimental farms. You see the drone photo here, different colors. These are different mixtures, different densities. And the project is ongoing. It's also complemented by greenhouse experiments and real farm experiments. So I could tell you that next time. Today, I will only show the results for that experimental farm. Okay. Basically, the motivation was there are many, many, many flower strips in Germany and abroad. They all look very different, and we don't understand why they become so different. We very often don't know what the effect of the differences are, and that's important if you want to decide where to place your things and what to sow. And for the sowing, I will tell you a short story now. Question is, let's compare seed mixtures and seed densities and their effects on biodiversity, and biodiversity is plant biodiversity. So the theory and the background is that if you have a gradient here on the x-axis from low to high diversity or density, so number of seed species sown or number of seeds sown per square meter, and then we look at the establishment of plants. We have good ecological reasons, and we can discuss that later, to have a quadratic relationship between diversity of seeds and the number of plants we establish of the target plants. While for the spontaneous plants, non-target plants, you would expect that the more seeds we sow and the more species we sow, the less favorable the establishment for non-target species would be. Leave it just as it is, and we can discuss that later, whether or not we believe in it. But basically, that was the motivation. Yeah, then we started that experiment. It's 6 replications. Sorry, the slightly shifted here. Also, the font is not correct, but no problem. We had a mixture, low diversity, only 26 species, commercial seeds. One of our standard things to be bought by the farmers, non-native seeds, Then we had 41 species, also commercial, non-native. Then we had 42 native regional seeds. And then we had 47 species, again, commercial, non-native. And finally, one of our seed producers, Johann Krimmer, produced his own mixture with 61 species, all natives, all regional. And we then started that experiment in 3 densities of seeding. And the results look like this. So this is just biomass, dry biomass. So we have again these 5 different mixtures that can be sown, actually are sown in flower strips. And you see there's large variation. And the first we want to filter off is the seed density variation. So you can imagine there may be some tendencies, but actually statistically not. So seed density has no effect at all. Taking the standard sowing or doing half of it or double makes no difference. While the seed mixtures have a significant effect, and this regional intermediate diversity actually is best statistically seen, while the low diversity non-regional is not doing so well. And actually is also not so much biomass in this high quality 61 species mixture. So if you find that interesting, audio, you may understand that the picture looks a bit blurred. Let's then go into this question for the native and non-native or sown and non-unsown species. And here again, you have these 5 mixtures, practical mixtures, and you see the dark gray things is species sown. And of course, the more species you sow, the more are established. So this sowing is this stipuled line here, more and more sown. And this just is the proportion here of species is established. And for the ones where we have the highest proportion is actually the second here, where we have a very good establishment, while the one where we have many, many species sown is actually not so good in the proportion of seeds. If you look at the ones that colonize, so the unsown ones, we have a negative relationship between the number of species and the proportion of unsown species established. So that's close to the theory I exposed. So there's something going on. Then if we look at the second survey, that was after 3 years, so 3 years later, after 4 years actually, this is more or less the same relationship. I don't go into details here again, because it's basically the same story, so the picture is stable. If you then go into the same story here, but now differentiated in species that insects love, so the insectophilous plants, flowering plants as they're sometimes called, on the grasses. As here is, if you are generous, it's like positive relationship, a quadratic relationship for the intermediate diversity things, no effect of density, seed density, and the grasses are actually doing not so well in these regional seeded intermediate diversity plots. Good. Then I come to the second conclusion, which is again very general. I would challenge you saying that these flower strips are not just ecological systems. They have an ecological domain, but they have also a technological domain. So the farmers need to be able to sow them. They need to manage them. And then there's a social domain. So some people love these flowers. There's also some socio-economic effect. So if you want to put them in place, we need all 3 people in place. And then we can use the flower strips in terms of substituting other things we would have, integrating the thing into the existing farm landscape and making them working operationalization. And for having that working, we need research like the ones we did, but we need also practical challenges, practical questions that we can then try to solve. So now I go to the final one, and I promise you being in time. So that's again Simon, now 4 years later. He has completed his PhD and did another major review of effects of flowering strips like the one here. That's actually one where I also paid for having it established. And he collected in the past years many, many publications. And the focus is here on spiders and beetles in flower strips. And you see this is from Denmark, Finland, Great Britain, so there's only a clump in northern Switzerland, so that's the only sorry thing. Otherwise, it's a nice distribution, and it's also more or less balanced. So we have 34 sets of data on beetles, and then we have 26 on spiders. So we can try to answer the question, how do these flower strips support, or how do they work on these insect groups? And the second question is, how does the landscape work, and how is the landscape then interacting with climate that has been wet in some years and has been dry in other years, or warmer or drier? So our question is simply, is there a landscape climate flower strip interaction? So the first question is then, of course, how's the overall effect? And that is one familiar. So in a less scientific way, you already saw that picture a bit earlier, but these are now the studies a bit more carefully analyzed. And you see this always on the right side of the stipuled line. This basically means for all groups, we have positive signals. This is true for abundance and species richness. If we then go for taxon-specific questions in beetles and spiders, so carabides or staphylonates, or the ladybird family, you see there is some variation. So in terms of abundance, carabides and staphylonates are supported by the flower strips. Also in terms of species richness, while for the ladybird family, it's actually slightly negative. Explanation could be that ladybirds very often hunt for aphids, and aphids are very common in arable fields. So maybe the flower strip has a slight negative effect here. For the spiders, there is positive effects here, but it's not significant for the richness. So now the famous interaction idea. Take a second. Yeah, what is this now here? On the upper level, it's beetles. The lower pair is also beetles. The upper one is abundance. The lower one is species richness. And then we have some variables of climate change. So we have annual temperature variation in the years the thing was done. Then we have also variation in winter temperature. Then there's variation in precipitation and variation in winter temperature in the lower ones. So I just picked the ones up that are significant. And here you see the interaction in terms of the surrounding landscape. Sorry. So some landscapes are very diverse. Some landscapes are medium in diversity. Some have low diversity. And you see the interaction between these effects. So I don't want to give you a rule out of that, but I just want to make you aware that the landscape then determines the effect the flower strip has on the variable climate on these insects. The same for spiders. Here it's the winter temperature and the precipitation, where there can be some interactions. Good. This goes to the final conclusion of that one, the conclusion 3. So the effect of flower strips depends on landscape context. So we have a very simple landscape on the left side, or a slightly more complex landscape on the right side. And that figure, which is originally done by Thea Czarnke, shows the biodiversity and ecosystem services along that gradient from a clear to a complex landscape. And if we have no management, then the clear landscape will be quite poor, and the complex still can have some species and some services, but there is a kind of differential between the ones where we have management, for example, in terms of flower strips, and where we don't have. And the recommendation by Thea is, let's go for these simple landscapes, because we have the greatest leverage in these ones, while the very simple ones are almost hopeless, and the complex ones have a luxury problem if a flower strip is established there. Okay, I come to the discussion and outlook. So these are some members of my group and farmers discussing hotly a flower strip. And the messages I would love to convey is the first one about crop biodiversity as alternative measure to flower strips. I would love having it because I believe that is more natural. It is feasible, but it's driven by many factors, among them socioeconomic factors, and that explains why farmers are not extremely happy taking it up. Second case, Francie's work indicates that you don't need to take too many species in your mixtures, but please don't take only a few species, and ideally take native seed material, so plants from that region and grown in that region, and don't go for sunflowers and all these Phacelia species that are more close to the heart of farmers. Seed density, there's no need to increase the density. Low density is also okay because the site is actually not so complicated, and even that would then suppress the unwanted spontaneous species if the species you sow are fitting. And finally, this interaction story. Yeah, climate change is moderated by the landscape, and that's one of the reasons one should think very carefully when establishing your flower strips in landscapes, depending on their diversity. There's some difference among taxa. We had only 2 large groups, so there's far more that could be done, but that's it for today from that side. So I take the final minutes I have just challenging you that a flower strip is not a flower strip, is not a flower strip. Because there's, as in grasslands, many types of flower strips, and people are actually not fully aware of the things they could do. So we could have one that are very good in terms of production, that could be useful for biomass. We could also have flower strips that are decidedly or explicitly focused on conservation. We could have some that are just for recreation. People love it along a cycle lane or whatever. We could have some that are important in terms of protection against erosion or whatever. We could have some along traffic roads where the flower strip then would make sure that the traffic, the roadside is stable. We could also have some of them that would help in draining sites where we have too much water. So there's enormous diversity, and they would then be matched by ecosystem services we expect from these flower strips. So it can be biomass production, it can also be pollination or biodiversity. And as far as I understand the literature and the practice, people are not really clear about what they want, and they don't articulate. They don't have a clear shopping list what they do when they establish a flower strip. So there's a big question mark here. And next time you invite me, I may tell you more about the interaction between these 2 axes, the technical measures and the conservation interest. Yeah, but that should not be the end. The end would be looking back at our restoration challenge by 1,000 measures, I would call that. So we should not give up, and we should not, because there is death by 1,000 cuts. We should answer that challenge by doing landscaping, by restoration based on 1,000 measures, and every individual measure, even if it's small, will do something nice. And nature positive solutions in agriculture, forestry and transport could be a part of that game, and I believe that flower strips play a significant role. But we need more types, and we need to tell people what type of flower strips they could have, and then we could design them as they should be, also depending on site conditions. Yeah, this morning, still in my bathroom, I saw that paper by Thea Czarnke, and he's one of my heroes. He's a very famous, now retired agroecologist in Göttingen University, and he just published that thing because he said, well, the left one just feels arable fields is not so beneficial. We don't get much biodiversity, common sense. If we go for flower strips like the middle one, it gets a bit more complex, but that should not be the end of the road. So the final goal should be a kind of diverse landscape where flower strips are just one element to enrich the landscape composition and configuration, and then eventually to benefit biodiversity. And in writing that, he explicitly says he is not keen to going back to the 19th century or 17th century. He wants modern landscapes that are functional in terms of biodiversity. Yeah, that should be the end. Unfortunately, most areas here around Freising or Munich look like this. Fortunately, there's a lot of funding, so thanks for that. Also, thanks for your attention. There are many things you can do. For example, you can buy a flower strip, as I did last year. So I went to a farmer and said, I'm willing to pay 1,000 euros. if you establish a flower strip for me, and he did, unfortunately, on very fertile soil. You saw it a few minutes ago. So that was not a big success, but I received a certificate, and I'm very proud on that. Yeah, that's all. I'm almost in time, and there should be time for questions, and I'm really curious to hear you have your questions. And to see you, I will now go out of the presentation mode.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for your inspiring presentation. I'm looking at the chat. There are no questions for the moment. If you have a question, please put them in the chat. I will start with the question myself. What is for you the main challenge for the near future?
The main challenge is designing flower strips that have a certain purpose. Because as it goes now, it's a kind of market. The farmers try doing standard agriculture where they buy something, and then as they do it for rape or corn or whatever, and they don't differentiate in terms of site conditions, and they don't distinguish among the objectives of the flower strip. And I think that needs to be developed. We need to develop certain objectives to have a diversity of flower strips, and then having the right seeds for doing so, and the right management systems. So although there have been 20, 30 years research on flower strips, I think this is a very wide gap.
Thank you. Your presentation was very clear because I don't see questions in the chat.
Hopefully nobody is frustrated now because I was too fast. Hans had a question.
Yeah, there is a question from Hans de Kroon. What about the persistence of flower strips? Is the intention to maintain them at fixed positions in the landscape? What species, perennials to use, and the value for biodiversity?
Good question. Yeah, thanks, Hans. Yeah, these are not persistent, so they are somehow flexible elements, and that's also the reason that farmers love it. Farmers are slightly skeptical when establishing a hedgerow or a grassland, but a flower strip is something for 5 years or 6 years, and then it's becoming slightly grassy. Also, France's experimental ones are now to be turned over. That's okay, but we need a kind of mosaic that these species can move from one flower strip to another one. And again, that would then need some planning, and I don't see that planning so far in our farmers. So it's all quite spontaneous and random, the things that happen.
In Holland, there are now rules to have, let's say, borders around arable fields, basically to prevent flow from nutrients into ditches and so on. And what we are experimenting with is, can we now, use these as flower strips in a more permanent way? And obviously, you have to do something with the farmers. The permanency is something they are reluctant with. But we also think that if you do this in the right way, and you can have your soil developing with native perennial plants, the value probably would be a lot more than only with the temporary strips that often use only annuals that need to be reseeded. But there are no
Hans, my suggestion would also be not to use only annuals. The flower strips we investigated in this Francie study for 5 years now. They have also lots of biennials or perennials, so it's not just the annual species. Sure. The annuals are for the first year. So I agree, if it would only be annuals, that would be slightly boring and not very efficient. But we have this mix. The ones you can buy commercially, they are biased towards these annual species like sunflower. Exactly. I fully understand, and they have not that positive effect in terms of stopping erosion in winter, so that's not ideal. But I would argue we need other types of flower strips that include perennial species that still can be plowed up, and that's okay. Because the problem for the farmer is having a grassland established, and then at least in Bavaria, the farmer would not be allowed to plow it because then it's a grassland, and that's a legal issue we have here. So, but some grasses would do, and as long as the farmer has the guarantee that he can then turn it into arable land again, it's fine. And that may also work for your cases of these frames around arable fields where you want to reduce erosion and leakage of nutrients and pesticides.
Yeah,
Thanks,
let's hope so. I think a bit, having more permanent patches really in the landscape would certainly work best, and you get a new dimension if also the soil biodiversity is developing. It is difficult, and you can only do this really in good collaboration with the farmers.
Yeah, Tim Diekerter from Kiel University, one of my collaboration partners, he did research on landscape scale, including annual flower strips and more permanent environmental schemes. And he actually is in favor of these short-lived things because it gives some flexibility, and the effect seems to be quite strong. Not for all species, not for all groups, but all overall.
It would be good to have a look in that work. Yeah.
Yeah. Tim Diekerter.
Thanks, Johannes. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Welcome.
Thank you. We will go to the next question. How much is paid for this type of agro-environmental measures?
I must say, I don't know. I'm not an economist. I had to read up. I don't know. I don't want to spread numbers. Maybe somebody knows in the audience. I'm not an agroeconomist. Oh, maybe it comes.
No. Okay. Another question, is there enough seed producers to meet the needs for diverse seed mixes, or does one want the farmers to produce their own seeds?
That is a very clever question. The other one I could not answer is also clever, but that one is welcome. Yeah, Germany has a large seed market and has also many producers. Saat and Zeller and Rega Hofmann are the main champions. They have in all parts of Germany seeds. They always collaborate with neighboring countries like Austria and Luxembourg. There's also seed production in France, maybe also in the Benelux countries. Yeah, so the problem is not that the species is not available. The problem is more a consultancy problem, that the farmers get not sufficient advice on using native seeds of native species for these flower strips. They go mostly with the ones advised by the farmers' unions and the agricultural research stations that are built on, yeah, as said, sunflowers, phacelia, buckwheat, and so on. So that is the issue. So there's good scientific reasons to use native regional plants, but it also practically works. But it's simply the consultancy way has not made it possible that farmers take it up. But it may come.
That's the last question. Thank you very much, Professor Kollmann. It was a very interesting speech. So this was the last webinar on grassland restoration. All webinars are recorded and they are available on the Interreg webpage. I'm pleased to announce the launch of a new webinar series starting in January, entitled Beyond Plant Blindness, Understanding and Protecting Native Biodiversity. This webinar series will explore how to develop educational settings that foster plant awareness and human-plant relationships, to understand the link between nature connectedness and pro-biodiversity behaviors, to engage communities in protecting plant and biodiversity, to use nature connection to relieve stress and exhaustion. We hope to see you all again then. Please spread the information in your network to your colleagues and friends. If you would like to attend this webinar series, please register. I would also like to add that in a few hours, you will receive an email with a questionnaire on reflections and learnings. It is very important for us to get your feedback. We would greatly appreciate if you could take some time to fill it in, as it really helps us to make recommendations for future steps in grassland restoration. The questionnaire is anonymous, but there is room for leaving your contact address for further invitations and getting news from EXPBIO. You can also stay in touch with the project EXPBIO by clicking a subscribe button on the EXPBIO webpage, which will be installed soon. Please do not hesitate to join our future work and activities. It was a real pleasure to meet you all at this webinar series, and I'm delighted to see that your large attendance proves that there is interest in grassland restoration. So I wish you good luck in your grassland restoration activities, and if you have questions, suggestions, or anything concerning the subject of grassland restoration, you may always contact us by mail. So on behalf of the entire EXPBIO team, I would like to thank you all for participating, and you're welcome next year to the new webinar series. I wish you all a happy 2026. Bye.
Bye-bye.